All right, folks. Thanks for bearing with us here. So as I said before, Prismic's first webinar with Tim Benniks from Valtech, going from Monolithic CMS to Microservices, how and why you should adapt to your stack. So first of all, my name is Adrian. I'm part of the sales team at Prismic, but the main star here is Tim Benniks. So I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. So I just introduced myself by guitar, which is, I think I've never done anything like that. But on stages, yes, but not in a webinar. So my name is Tim Benniks. I'm from Amsterdam, and I live in Paris. And I am the director of web development at Valtech, and I'm mainly focusing on Paris and Europe, but also more global work. And we do a whole bunch of big enterprise projects where we do the monolith thing that we will discuss today, but it's also microservices, and sometimes we are migrating clients that way and sometimes we don't. And yeah, so I think it's pretty interesting to discuss like the higher level crazy kind of global clients in this context. So that's why we're here today. Let's see the screen. There we go. So you might say, who is this dude? We don't know him, but I have some sort of credibility, as you can see on the clients I've worked for, because I've only been doing a lot of conference stuff and going outward with my work since beginning of last year. So I just did buckle down and work for all those crazy big clients. So with that, you have a lot of pain and problems, but you also learn a whole bunch. So I'm super happy that Adrian asked me to be here so we can discuss all this.
Absolutely, yeah. So we'll be obviously sharing the presentation here, so you have all the links for Tim to reach out to him through his social medias.
Cool.
So first, we're going to talk, obviously, very briefly a little bit about, what is monolithic architecture, what are microservices. So first, here's kind of like a rundown of a kind of like a generic monolithic architecture. I think we're going to be focusing today mainly on CMSs in general. And as you can see from the graph, it's basically just having a one-stop shop, one solution for all of these. So this is typically going to be your site cores, your WordPress, your Drupals. And I think we kind of listed here some of the pros and cons. So Tim, if you want to maybe elaborate a little bit on that.
Oh, yeah, sure. So first, what we need to say here, and it's important to caveat this, that we can kind of get probably most of the pros and cons with whatever solution we choose, but we're kind of now looking at the most average solution that you have, right? And so if you have a monolith, one of the pros, it says stability, it's the one deployment process. So it's a singular thing, right? It's like this one big block with everything inside of it, which you generally get with those kind of bigger platforms, especially the site cores and stuff. And the drawback of it is that you kind of choose, this is your ecosystem and this is what you have to use. And if you want to plug in something else that might be a bit better, it's really hard to do. So it's a little bit less easy to scale and a little bit less easy to be flexible. And by scaling, I mean, if you have something super complex and it all runs on like 2 or 3 servers in the same bucket, and then you get Christmas time, you have to peak, it's really hard to scale that. Like, how does it work with your database? You cannot just make 25 SQL servers. That doesn't really scale, right? So if you didn't have that one big chunk, but you had them separated, sometimes easier to scale. And I think costly can work for both sides, let's be honest. Vendor lock-in, however, is a real thing. For example, I'm a front-end guy, so I will likely focus a bit more on that. If you think about Sitecore, you always get Bootstrap out of the box, which is a CSS framework. It has some JavaScript, but also jQuery, an old version, mind you. And it doesn't mean you cannot rip that out. We do that. But by default, this is the thing you play with. Right? If you want some sort of personalization engine, yeah, we have that. If you want a user account, yes, we have that. And so you are kind of stuck with that. It's generally good, but not always, right? And that's why we're here today, to see how to explore other things. Did that make sense, Adrian?
Yeah, absolutely. That was great.
Okay,
great,
cool.
Great summary. I think that is obviously going to be a caveat we're going to be talking about throughout this conversation here. Obviously, monolithic and microservices depends a lot on your own project, on the type of website you're managing, the type there.
Clearly, yes.
So obviously, we're Prismic here, we're headless CMS, so we're going to be more geared towards microservices and having kind of a different approach here. And that's what we're seeing right now. Basically having all these different microservices like we're seeing here, like Cloudinary, Algolia, Stripe, Discuss, or potentially CMS such as Prismic that could communicate from going from all these databases and communicating with each other in order to then deliver to a user interface, wherever that may be. So in terms of pros and cons here that we're seeing, I mean, Tim, I'll let you talk more about that, but I was going to talk things about performance and scalability. It all depends.
Yeah, it all depends. What we did learn, however, things like if you look at the costs part, for example, that kind of fits also with the performance. It all kind of fits in place because let's say you have users log in and then you have users. Let's have an example of, let's say you're like Nike running, right? And you want to show your run on a map. You generally have to log in once. And then you might hit their API a couple of times to get some data, and then to get it all together, and then to look at that run. A lot of people will do that because that's the thing that's on your website. But me, to get that data, I only log in once. So if you have a service for logging in, a microservice, you only hit that once. And imagine the cost is based on how often you hit it. Like, it doesn't have to be up and running all the time, consuming power, and you paying for that if you don't use it. Because if it's in a SaaS solution, most likely other people are using it, and then when you don't use it, they use it, so you don't pay for that. And that also happens to work well for performance. Maybe the login one is not a good one here, but if you can think about microservices as little islands, right? Some islands you use more and some you use less. And if you need to scale a specific thing, like come Christmas time again, you just have to scale that one little island. So we've seen this on a client where basically the, how do you call this? Like it's like the wish list around Christmas was a huge thing. People were making wish lists and they could send it to their boyfriends or girlfriends and they would buy jewelry. That was by far the most used part. And that was actually a third party. And we had really good connections with them. And basically that was the thing that scaled. That's where we paid, but we didn't pay for the other stuff. And we didn't have to hire a company to help us orchestrate scaling that whole platform. We only had to scale that one part. And this is kind of what we loved about this, right? And so that's where you go with these best-in-class solutions. Because if you think of Prismic, how they handle the content, how the API is stable, how easy it is to use, this is clearly one of those for certain areas, a best-in-class. And they might not win on other areas, but it means if you need that specific thing, just go to that one thing and pay them and make it happen. And if you have a Sidecore or a WordPress, it's really hard to do. You can, but it costs extra effort again. And then the cons, and honestly, the biggest con to me personally is how you orchestrate everything. Because if you have a monolith, generally you can see it as a tower of blocks that you go like this. And if you remove one block, the rest falls over. Oops, that was my mic. The rest falls over, right? It's not always true, but generally. If in WordPress one database connection doesn't work, you generally don't see your page. When you have microservices, they're all scattered around, but they're not depending on each other, or they might. But if one falls away, the rest still works. And you don't always see that. So how do you deal with that? Right? So there's just more brain power needed to orchestrate how they work. And they might all scale slightly differently. So you need to have different ways. Or if you want to deploy a new version of something, you might want to do an A/B test, and then you can use Kubernetes, for example, all this fun stuff. But again, there's so many configurations. Being a cloud engineer is actually very, very complicated. And so the orchestration complexity makes it hard. And of course, if you want to do a true test from the beginning to the end, you have to hit all those things to see if they all have, if they're all working. If they are working, it's easy. But if not, you need to find and pinpoint where that went wrong. And so based on those things, it is also more complex. And there are some solutions here, but it don't work for everybody. You can go the Jamstack approach, where you just go to the content and some other stuff once, and you just build one static app that then talks to other microservices, so you have less services to talk to. Potentially that can work, because that's something that can help you with scaling of your app itself, or with the front, or vulnerabilities, right? So you want to make sure that's less. So yeah, so there's a lot of pros and cons here, but it's still an interesting approach, I would say.
Cool. Well, actually, I mean, that's what we're going to dig into right now, is to like basically, how do you make this decision? You know, like when do we want to, like, why would I switch to microservices? Basically, I've got this monolithic, it's great. Why would I want to do that?
Well,
I guess one of the biggest things, I mean, we're talking about that in terms of cons for the monolith, is that vendor lock-in. Basically, you've got that one solution. You know, it's fine, it does the job well, it's rich in features, it's got everything you want, but maybe there's like that one tool that does a little bit better, and that one other tool that does a little bit better. And so, tell us a little bit more, I guess, about that, and like how teams can work maybe more autonomously with microservices.
Well, you actually said it really well. It's like generally those bigger suites of monoliths, they are actually really good, and they are becoming now, like if you look at Adobe AEM, they have multiple services now that all fit in that same bucket. So they became microservices, but each microservice is a huge monolith. That can kind of work because they give you everything. But the issue is, if you want to change one thing, there's a lot of effort there. And that's generally what makes it so hard. And so what we see sometimes is that you can kind of mix it up. So we have one monolith and a couple of smaller things, and over time you can change it. But yeah, so I would say, if your team is senior enough and your client is mature enough, it's generally, I would say, pretty easy to not have this vendor lock-in, and to actually choose the best tool for that thing. If you want to have a really good image management, you go for Cloudinary. It's a quite clear option. You could actually argue for content editing. Most likely Prismic works really well, but you can also do something in between, and that's where it kind of gets interesting, for where a lot of the brands are in now, where you would have a sidecore, but you don't want to use the membership module, but you use a Gigia, which is an external tool that can kind of connect well. So you now see that all those third parties or microservices or SaaS systems, basically when they go live, their main goal is to be as flexible as possible, so they can kind of easily connect to all those bigger systems. And so if your team has the maturity and understanding, they can choose the right things very specifically. And because of that, you can maybe go really fast to market, because you have specialists that know those tools. Or it's way cheaper, because having a Sidecore personalization engine, that's actually a pretty expensive package. And if you use another tool, that might be way easier and way less expensive to use. So you can just use that and connect. So it kind of, it's more freeing, but you also get a bit more responsibility to deal with. Because if it doesn't work, and you say to this CMS vendor, hey, it doesn't work, so yeah, you chose to go outside, right? So there you go. If we go to the next, about the performance, it's really a caveat, because it gives you the ability to improve performance. And also performance might be different to different people. Me as a web developer, performance for me is, first of all, how fast is that page? But it's not in numbers. It's how fast does it seem to be? And that's a really important part here. Because if we build a single page app with React, that first page load, if you look at the numbers, it's probably not that fast, because it has to load a lot of stuff. But then subsequent page loads are really, really fast. And so having those microservices, you can just say, okay, I'm going to have a very simple node server, which has this React app on it that I can scale to infinity. So it's super fast. And then you just connect the microservices against it. You know, we've done this with Sidecore as well, and with Adobe also, but there's a lot more tooling to set that up. So you definitely have the ability, but you have to be really good at your job to figure that out. Adrian, if you have anything, just jump in.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, I was going to talk about this one. Yeah, the reducing time to market for content. I think that's a big one. I think it kind of speaks back to what we were talking about for team autonomy at the beginning, and just, you know, that's actually one of the biggest things that I see from our users that are going from a Sitecore to something like Prismic is, content teams that are just so frustrated that they can't just publish content. They just, they have to go through so many hoops and all that. And I think a good example of that recently was everyone who had to update their websites for like COVID-19, updates or whatever. And they need to put a pop-up on their website. And then we actually saw a lot of our users saying, that like reduce that time to market for content. Like they can create that very, very quickly with that tool because it solely does that. It's like just about content, updating it. With the caveat, of course, like everything needs to be set up in a way that you can do that quickly, and also that you have a team on hand. Because if you're adding any kind of new design, anything like that, you do need to have competent people there that can implement that.
Yeah, I think with this part, it all comes down to how your project is set up and how many historical choices you have made that influence that process. Like we have certain clients where images have to go through very specific approval processes, cropping by a photographer because we cannot crop off the nose of a model, like all of this kind of stuff. And to just go live with something, generally bigger companies have a change of people that actually where it has to go through. And so if you have a microservices setup, that can still be the case, right? But you are right though. Like if you have, let's say, a Sitecore, we come back to that once in a while, but basically is they have a content management server, and then they have a content delivery server, and they have a CDN, there's all this stuff, and that all needs to sync up, and it just takes longer, and sometimes there's a deploy needed. So yes, with those big systems, it can take really long, but it can also be really fast. If you have something in place that works already really well and people constantly publish, it's great. You just need to know what to publish. But I would say if you are setting up something new and you can really think about what are the parts that I need, clearly having a simple system like a Prismic or a Storyblock or a Contentful, they work so well because enterprise has all these rules. But for some reason, over time, those rules grew and grew and grew and grew. And you know what? Generally, those rules are internal processes to the people that make them. And if you look at a sheet of paper with all those rules, you can usually cross off 80%. Not always. It also depends on how mature that client is and what they like. If you have 50 markets, right, and you have a central organ to figure out content, like some of our clients, you're not going to just let people run wild with it. But if you're a slightly smaller organization, having the ability to have a really simple CMS that just works without any frills, it's actually pretty cool, right? So that's much easier. So yeah, this is a very convoluted answer because it can go anywhere.
For sure.
But this is what we're dealing with, right?
I think it's a really good point that you bring up, like companies, especially that operate on multiple markets with different legislations, with different kinds of content they can publish or not. And then you have like copyrights coming into like what assets you can publish and all that. That's when it's true. Sometimes having that one big solution might be even better. But it's true maybe for like a smaller project. And I think what we're going to talk about that a little bit later is like what parts of your web property can you put on a microservice and what's maybe better off staying on a monolithic approach.
Well, if you look at that, well, I might be skipping one, but we just touched on like having this multi-tenant thing, because some of the projects I work on for L'Oreal, for example, when you look at L'Oreal Paris, they have about 60 markets, but this company is structured in such a way that they are decentralized. So each market kind of has their own website and they can choose, this is how I sell. So we've built infrastructure and architecture that they all have the same quality website, with the same stack, the same unit testing, the same performance, but they can choose their own content. And L'Oreal wants them to do their own campaigns and their own way of selling. And so in that case, something like a very simple content editing system that just works because it's designed well by the developers also, like which components can I combine and stuff like that, then it can suddenly work really well. So if you have a look at, for example, like the slice machine that Prismic came out with Nuxt, that is actually a really cool system. If you enhance that, if you customize it for the needs of your client, that means, so I'll explain it a little bit for the audience, because they might not know. Yeah, it's like a default set of components that work really well, where in Prismic, in the CMS, you can pretty easily like drag them around and add content to them and replicate 20 of them, stuff like that. And then in the front end, it's a really well thought out system with good accessibility, flexibility. When I used it, I didn't like all aspects of it, but I'm a web dev. That's just what's going to happen. but it's also very extensible. And so when you have something like that that really works and you give that to these markets and it's very easy to work with, yeah, then actually this is like, it can fly, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, we're seeing a lot more of those approaches, or people sometimes like centralizing the data from one place and then like having it delivered to the teams, then them being able to localize it. We are seeing more of that approach, and just basically splitting up the content, having just different teams working on that way.
Yeah, we always see different nodes of content. So we tend not to share, because then if you share something, there's all these extra rules. Because what happens if you kind of screw up something that you are inheriting from, then 20 websites break.
Yeah.
Right. But this is my life. I have to be honest. We're constantly dealing with this kind of, okay, we have a new project and they had 1 million pages. Can you just import them? Oh, but these pages were made like 10 years ago. So they have like inline styling for the Japanese market to make sure that everything works. Yeah, that's realistic, right? So sometimes this is actually kind of a pro for the monoliths, because they might be 15 years old and they probably have dealt with this kind of craziness.
That's true.
And so,
It is something we do ask sometimes though our users whenever like they're transitioning. It's like, like that million documents in your database. Like, do you need to keep all that? Like, I
no,
know
you
you want
don't.
this recipe, but a
You
lot of
don't.
times, like, who's actually going to access that content? Although,
Yeah, this is the same with things like personalization. Everybody wants it, and then they realize how much content editing that actually means, because you can make a persona for this personalization or a persona for that one, and then each component has a state for that personalization. But what happens if you have 20 components and 16 personas? That's 20 times 16 or 60, whatever, content editing items you have to do. So I always say just drop it. You don't need it. But I digress.
yes. So going back here, I guess to the slide and scaling costs. I think that's like one of the big things, and I think you have some experience you were telling me about last time about like versus having that big monolithic approach that you're handling on premises, like you're managing all of that versus something like a tool that's basically mutualized, where the resources are just going to load up whenever you need them. If we're talking about an e-commerce, obviously getting very, very heavy loads during Black Friday week, and then maybe in the summertime, maybe not needing all those machines.
Yeah, so what we now have, we have many more headless implementations now, and we're trying to kind of combine having a super static thing that is on a very low level server in the cloud, right? And then on build time, we kind of do the Jamstack thing. There we use the Prismics and all the fancy stuff to make those pages work. And then some parts, let's say if it's e-commerce, they have to be dynamic, right? So we kind of use the CDN a lot more nowadays, because we actually put that static stuff very close to the user. And if you want to scale that, you just add more locations where you put the static files, and it scales indefinitely. And it's much cheaper, because these servers, it's either a static server or it's a low-level Node.js server. And however, we are learning that if you do server-side rendering with Node.js, it's kind of at runtime, it has to build an app and then it gets hydrated with JavaScript. That's a pretty heavy thing to do. But if your app is built well, let's say you use Nuxt, then that is doable. And then, so the only thing we worry about right now is not scaling some database cluster. We actually only care about scaling those cheap node servers. So it's very easy to scale them to 5 or 15 and then scale them down very fast. And it's super cost efficient, because the front end just looks at that. And yeah, this is something that can, if you do it the right way, can have a positive impact. And you can also look at like functions as a server, like Lambda functions, right? If you separate things out, you don't have very expensive, heavy servers running with all functionality. It's very lightweight, tiny functions in the cloud. If you don't hit them, you don't use them, you don't pay for them. And because they're so small, they're really easy to scale, because they don't know about everything next to them. So this is where it can become a bit complex, because those functions can depend on one another. But if you architect it right, like I did it myself, I did an application where I'll tell it short, because otherwise it's too long. I did a talk about that, Jamstack talk actually, but the Jamstack part was a very simple application, but actually all the microservices around it made it super scalable. Because what I did is I used to be a marathon runner. Not now, I'm a bit fat. I'm in France, I eat croissants. But before, and what I learned is like it's character changing, right? When you run 25K and you actually did it. And me being a data nerd, I want to have all that GPS data. I want to see how long it took me, my heart rate. So I used Strava for that. That's an application on your phone or in your watch. And I wanted to get that data and embed it on my homepage. But that embed system was really ugly. It didn't really work. And Strava doesn't want you to embed it on your blog. So I decided, you know what, I'm just going to talk to the API, get the stuff, and make my own 3D globe that shows my run while you follow it.
Cool.
The fact that I did it that way doesn't matter for this story. It's kind of fun to do a 3D globe when you see yourself live running. But the whole point is I actually made I made my own microservices. They were all Lambda functions in the cloud on their own, not knowing about each other. But I had one to log into Strava. I had one to fetch all my activities of the last month. I have one to filter that list. And I have one to get one run information. And I had one to convert data to a JSON object that I used to plot that run. But all of those didn't really know about each other. They just need a token so they can log into Strava and get the data. That's it. So that login, I didn't use much. So I didn't have to scale it. I just put some cache in front of it so it would store the token. And then getting the list didn't happen as much. But when I embedded that thing on my page, that was hit a lot. So that little function that had to get that data just scaled up. And it cost me €4, I think, in half a year. That's it. And I had everything I wanted. And I had a limit to how much I could query Strava. So I did add some little cache in front of that function, which was also as a microservice. There's not one big cache block that has everything. It's just a little bit of cache in front of that function so that's also a distributed approach. And when that started to happen, it started to open up to me. It's like, why haven't we done this before, right? What is this thing? It's awesome. It's so easy. And as it turns out, my brother transitioned to being more of a cloud engineer. And he used to build iPhone apps, and now he's more a backend dev. And he showed me, especially with AWS, how you could sync up all those functions and basically build all your architecture of a whole app just like that. And then connect some third parties like a Prismic or whatever. And you have it completely organized in the cloud, and your code is not that much because your code doesn't have to connect everything. It's just those functions. Of course, the orchestration idea that we just discussed makes it more complex. You need to know about all those functions and how they work. But that to me was a new paradigm. And especially because it like I have a monthly account for Azure. I get $140 from work. It's really cool. And I spent 4 of them every month. And I have like a lot of functions running. I have a lot of things happening. Because those cloud services, they only become expensive if you want to do search indexation and if you want to do CDN. But I don't use them, so it's really cheap. So yeah, just why not try, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think that takes us to, why would you want to switch to microservices? These are some of the arguments that we're seeing here. And I guess takes us to the next slide. Should you? Like, when does it make sense to switch from microservice? So we're going to talk a little bit briefly about, most people are going to be starting from an existing project, but what happens if you're just starting from scratch? If you're maybe a smaller company, or maybe if you're starting like a smaller project, we see that a lot for like larger corporations that are maybe having some kind of a big marketing project, and they have some new launch of a product or something, and they just want to go with that, being like try a newer approach.
Well, we discussed this before. It's actually it's a bigger story here to see what you choose. It's not just the product. Right? Of course, in the end, your end users are always number one. But imagine your team has knowledge of other things, or they don't have much knowledge, or you outsource and you have to teach, or there are cultural differences. There's so many assets in a project that have to work together to get a good output. It might actually not be the right choice for your project to go with all the microservices if your team is not up to it. right? And also, people used to think like if we have the microservices, it's always a headless front end. That's what people think. It doesn't have to be the case, but generally that's true. Not every website needs that. Sometimes it's a very simple approach and you don't need to do that. Of course, nowadays we have things like Nuxt or Next, if you look at React, where it's kind of mixed in. But if you think about it, you're rendering your front-end components in the backend and in the front end. It's a lot of extra stuff. So if your website is literally just pages with images and text like a blog, you clearly don't need that. It's a lot of extra effort to build, even though the people from those companies make it super hard to work, super easy to use those tools. It's still kind of a weird approach to a website, right? HTML is just HTML.
Mm-hmm.
So for some projects, it might make more sense if you can provide a really good editor experience for the content editor, so they spend a lot less time on getting this thing out than saying, oh, we need headless and we need that thing and we need that thing. In that case, it might be more interesting to have a WordPress that everybody knows, that I don't have to teach you. And then you might actually add a cloudinary for images on top. And you might add later other things, but your base can be as simple as that, because learning curve is a big thing, especially when you're on a global company. For example, I work on projects with people from Amsterdam to Sao Paulo to New York to Denmark, or we have a lot in Ukraine, and all these people work in different ways. It's just culturally set. And you need something with this really shallow learning curve if you want to be able to go fast. And sometimes you need to go fast. We'll talk about that later, I guess. But sometimes when you have the time, it's a different thing. If I could build a team of 20 people right now to work for 2 years, I would clearly choose this with best in breed and really specific. But if I have to go live in 4 months for 60 markets with a beautiful website where the client only cares about how fast I can do a release or how much content they can add, then maybe a monolith that already exists, that had a lot of documentation, that has, if I just shout into LinkedIn, I get 20 people for, that might actually be a better approach, right? It's kind of a business decision.
Absolutely.
Which is not fun to say on a webinar about microservices, but this is real life.
No,
right? I just started a new project on a monolith. It's going to be great. I can tell you, we do it in 3 sprints of 2 weeks. We, however, do use modern front end, but we mix it with the old stuff, right? We're not making a single page app. We're doing a server-side render .NET application, and we sprinkle on top some Vue.js to make it awesome. Which means out-of-the-box SEO is great. Without JavaScript, shit just works because it's all rendered HTML. So we kind of do old school projects with new school technology. And that is a really valid business case also. Because I needed Sitecore people. I ask one time and I get 20 of the best there are because I work at Valtech. So I'm lucky we have that. But if I ask them, give me people who know React, Node.js, TypeScript, integration testing with third parties, a cloud engineer, that's a very different ask, right? So it's going to take some more time to get there.
So you talked a lot about like starting from scratch and going from maybe monolith or microservices. What about an existing project? Like, what are the situations where you've seen like it was a good moment to switch from that monolithic to a microservices approach?
We have a couple, and I cannot name names. I know some of the people who are in the attending this, they will know what I'm talking about. But it's official business. I cannot say it. But basically, we have this one client. They're from Paris. They're basically one of the more luxury brands in the world. So to them, a release needs to be perfect. Every pixel needs to be in place. Otherwise, it doesn't feel like a unicorn anymore, right? It's no longer magical. So I think their system was 15 years old. It's an old Java bucket of stuff with a lot of e-commerce things, very complicated, a lot of products inside the monolith. And it used to be a Flash website. And then then they had to build a mobile website separate. Remember when we built separate mobile websites, the crazy times? No responsiveness. So they built a mobile website, and that evolved into like a sort of a responsive adaptive site over the years using this crazy Java stuff. I'm not trying to offend anyone here. It's just the way they implemented the Java things to render a front end was not the right way. That's just the way it goes, right? History, time, pressure, you make decisions and it grows. And it grew to such a way that it took 48 hours to do one release. And generally, those releases didn't always work.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to roll back because in China, they're starting to buy again. And then you have to roll back because otherwise you don't sell. And it's not always 48 hours, of course. Sometimes it's a 24 one. But imagine that. If you have Prismic, it's like 3 minutes. Like, this is crazy. And what they also didn't have, of course, is if you don't separate your front end from your back end, from your iPhone app, all the things are in the monolith. So if I change one color to red, I need to do a 24-hour deployment. If I change some content that also needs a bit of code, it's a huge effort. And because this thing was so old, changing content sometimes needed a deployment because the database server needed to be deployed to 24 other things that it then scales. And you know what? It is one of our best clients. It's an amazing looking project. It's making a shit ton of money. So it works. I mean, that brand is doing that. And for us too. So this is all positive. But at one point they said to us, like, we just need to separate this front end from the back end because first of all, the performance is just not good if you have that Java system render the front end. It was just a lot of runtime, like PHP-like runtime things. And it was just too slow. So here, what we proposed is, sure, we can do, let's research what you need. Let's research your business requirements. And the business requirement was, we need to release something every 2 weeks. We need to have an iterative thing constantly going, changing, because this client is really mature. So what they had to do is if they make the button that color on Saturday and that color on Monday, I need to be able to test and see. So we had to change quite often. We had to release very often. But imagine if you have that old system, releasing that often is basically your whole job is releasing. It's not writing code, right?
Yeah.
So for them, we proposed, we're going to have to go headless. That's a first start. And then over time, other things might come in, other microservices. But currently what we had to do is, okay, we cannot do a big bang. Which, by big bang, I mean you work for 2 years, and at one point, suddenly there's a new website. Brands like this who innovate a lot creatively, storytelling-wise, they cannot wait for features. It's not realistic.
So basically you're saying a lot of times like reactivity, being able to have that custom content, that's what drove them to do that. And also being able to deliver content on different devices, being able to customize it there, focusing on content, and then having that separate. So that was like the big approach of headless, was basically just separating the front end and the back end.
Yeah. And so what we actually propose for them is, okay, we're going to go with Nuxt, which is a really good front end framework. It's really mature nowadays. And we use Vue.js and not the other stuff. It took them 6 months to decide because they didn't believe us and because it's hard. These are hard decisions. They are business changing decisions. And I'm looking at the chat, and Debbie works at Nuxt. She's very happy with that, I hope. Yeah, exactly. So basically, we gave them the easy approach, which made it really hard for us, but really great for them. So we said, okay, we're going to just redesign the old system completely using an amazing creative agency in Paris. And so we basically gave them a redesign that we implemented on the old website, which was a shit ton of work because when you look at that website and you change one thing, something Korea website falls over, and then it works in Korea, but it fails in the New York website. It's insane. We did that job to show them a quick change. And at the same time, we started working on this Nuxt implementation, and we started building an API layer on the old system that Nuxt could talk to. So next to doing new releases on the old system to keep things working, we also added a data layer as API on that old system. And then we spent like 6 months on developer experience for that Nuxt build, right? So we spent a lot of time actually, because that we could do that because they were also redesigning and rebuilding the old one. So they saw progress, and we were in parallel working on that next thing until it was really good. And every developer that touched it could just do it like this, build a component, run with it. It was unit tested, accessibility tested, everything that you needed. And then at one point, page by page, we would have a sprint where we would build one component for the homepage, and we would ask the backend guys, build an API just for that component, or do whatever you need to do in the old system to get the data to me. And then slowly, we're just grabbing pages. So we did the homepage first, and we released the homepage to 20 markets. So the first release was like from Japanese to right to left to, it's crazy, but that worked. And now we did a product page, and now we did a product list page. And then slowly we're going to start on the checkout, which is going to be a real challenge. But so we kind of we gave them the choice to not wait for a long time, do a big bang, and then potentially fail 2 years in, spending millions. We actually worked together really close to the client. We actually have a whole team at the client office where they constantly are with us to figure out how it works. And now they made a really solid API layer. And now their iPhone app looks at that layer too. And suddenly that development went super easy. And I can tell you over time, we're going to do many more things. We might get different systems to render images, or doing user accounts, or especially having things like faceted filtering for the search for the products. For them, this is a huge thing. They have full-time people to say, hey, but that bag cannot be next to that shoe. It doesn't look good. Every day they're constantly changing how that works. That's a very challenging job. So we might say we go to another system like Algolia that is super mature doing just that. And then we start to implement all the microservices on top. And then this old system is going to stop at one point. And we just plug in something like Commerce Tools, which is a headless e-commerce. But we can plug it in because we have a nice API layer. We can plug things on both sides, right? And this is a common story where we basically provide people with small steps so it's easier to switch, because this is another thing that makes it a little bit hard, and that might go to the next point.
Yeah.
Best of breed or best of suite. If I now go to a big client of ours that is a global and has a lot of writing on their website, and they say, okay, let's go Prismic. It's like, who is Prismic? Show me an SLA document. Show me a security document. Show me their CEO. Like, I've been in meetings with C-suite people where they would destroy us for even bringing up something other than their suite, because it took them 5 years to make a contract, and they paid a lot of money. And then there's this guy from Paris. He's like, why are you using this? Those are not easy conversations. Right. And so that's why for that other brand, it took us like 6-7 months to figure out what is the right way. And they audited what we chose to use. And that's only good. Like, it might feel, if you're from the country where I'm from, in the Netherlands, that feels really bad. But in France, trust is built based on relationship. And when you make that relationship and you constantly work, suddenly that trust is there, and then we run with it. So it just takes time. And so when people say best of breed, it's like, okay, we choose all the microservices that we want, that this developer architect thinks is the best. It's pretty dangerous, kind of works. Best of suite is, okay, we go Adobe with everything from analytics tracking to personalization to search to content to, I think Adobe has everything. It's ridiculous. They even have like design suites that can render front-end components. Like, there's all this stuff. The drawback of best of breed, where we choose exactly what we want, we cannot really finger point, because as an agency, finger pointing is more important than you realize. Let me try to explain. I see your face. What I mean by this is, okay, we set up a system and it doesn't perform, but we use the out-of-the-box stuff. I can now call this CMS and say, okay, guys, so you advertise this, we pay 1 million, and now we use it, and that's what's left. It doesn't work. Finger point, which means there's a contract, right? And if we don't perform, Valtech has to pay a fine, for example. Like, on high-level clients, it's super important that it performs. And if it suddenly doesn't perform after some update, I can actually say, I have this huge contract with this monolithic system, this suite of tools, and I can just say, yeah, fix it. And they likely will. But if I have best of breed, which is like 20 different contracts, what do? I chose those things to work together. Maybe they don't work that well together. Maybe after 2 months, I have to switch Prismic for Storyblock. It's not likely, but whatever, right? That happens. And suddenly, those contracts as tech agencies, that's harder. Because I feel kind of safe choosing a technology and I just push it to the limit. And if it's one of those sweet things, we can actually call them up and say, hey, this is the issue, try to fix it, and they generally will. So yeah, there's a difference there.
I think that actually, that goes back to what we're talking about, like having people that are competent enough to know all these tools and how they all work together. Because it's true, as you're saying, best of suite, you have that one point of contact, you have that one contract. If they don't reach that performance, you can reach out to them directly. And I think we can talk to our support team about that. Like sometimes they just have these questions like, this is completely unrelated to the solution that we're providing, but just because it has to work in tandem with all these different other microservices in the end.
I've already had them with Prismic, I think. Those kind of questions. It's just how it goes, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think it's bad because everybody learns from that. It's just you need to realize that if you're an idealistic programmer or an architect and you just push this and push this, there might be a CTO of a bigger company that pushes you back and you don't understand, and this is the reason. Right? We generally have KPIs to reach of reusability of code or certain performance in certain places or security in certain places. And we reach those things by contract that might not even be the best for the end user. Sometimes you just need to reach your KPI so your contract is done, and then the maintenance company does the rest, which is ridiculous, but these are constructs that exist.
I think, for sure, going for a best of breed approach, definitely, it's like you're focusing more on the business teams and their requirements, or, if it's the marketing team that's making the decisions here, they're the ones who are going to focus on that experience of creating content. If it's more like indexations, something more like Algolia, and that's where they're going to prioritize, like, okay, we're going to go for best of breed because we want this, and potentially this best of suite solution does not offer that.
No, exactly. And best of breed also locks you into something. Like we did this L'Oreal program where we spent 5 years on Sitecore, morphing it into something that we could use, but learning a lot on the way. And Sitecore has certain products in it, and we moved them by 7 versions a year by finding things that didn't really work or worked well, but were designed in a different way, because we deal with scale. We deal with 800 websites, 1,000 deploys a day, right? So it's also cool to have this best in suite kind of thing. So you learn a lot about it. The sad thing is, though, if I spent 10 years on that and I didn't do anything else, you've kind of lost touch and you're an expert in something that I would say those systems will survive and they will change into whatever the outside world forces them into. Which is
we're seeing happening. It now, right? Like a lot of these solutions are going for a headless approach, more or less, and it's.
But what's funny about that is they are saying it's headless, but it's not really headless. It's not a problem. It's just not. And this is what makes it hard, because they basically say for Sitecore, for instance, they did really good stuff to make it work, because what they used to have is something called an experience editor, which means you run your website and in experience editor, you can actually change the website based on how your website looks. So you can drag and drop components in the look of your site and you can do everything you've ever dreamed in that interface. Amazing. It's built for a monolith, for a one thing fits all. And now, after 10 years of that, they said, oh, we have to go headless, which kind of invalidates that whole thing, because your content editor is going to be probably a form. And so they had to come up with something clever to say, okay, we cannot lose this personalization thing and this experience editor thing. So why don't we just build, let's say, React components for a title to render or text or an image. And when you are in edit mode, we just run a Node.js server in our own monolith next to it, basically, and then put them in edit mode. So now that component makes you edit the thing. And then when you hit save, the database is updated. And then when you show it on the front end, those components go into show mode, which means these systems have now had to build front-end components that can do all this complicated stuff. And it's all kind of new still. And it all works, right? They did it. I think it's an achievement on its own that they did that. But it's really hard to work with because it's kind of advertised. Okay, if you're a front-end dev, you can now use this headless because on your MacBook, you don't need .NET run with it. That's just not true because you have to know the system really well to be able to run with it. And once you know it well, we can have really successful projects. Like easyjet.com, we built that on that system. It's completely headless. It works really well. But we had people who are specialized in Sidecore, right? They are full stack developers. So that makes it a bit harder. And I'm not here to stab at them or saying they do bad things. They don't. They actually do great stuff. They are moving along. They are hiring amazing front-end developers to actually build those tools. The one thing I don't like about it is that they kind of, and all of them have this, is they say, okay, this is an example app of how you can use your headless system. And this is an example app of how you host it. If you are in the best of suite mindset, you're just going to use that example app, right? They give you that, that's what you use because these are the gods that built that for you. Turns out when we then find an issue, they're like, yeah, it's just a suggestion. You can just use it this way or you do it your own way. But you need so much knowledge of the entire ecosystem behind it to do that yourself that it's just not realistic. In our case, it is because we have real experts, but that's like the 2%. And so they kind of sometimes make the mistake of building something as very quick, release it fast, show it open source. This is how you do it. And then don't realize that every big brand is going to take that open source code. And then it doesn't scale. Oops. And that happens, right? So that's the drawback of being a big system, have to move super fast. And what I love about companies like Prismic or Content Stack, it came from some sort of frustration with those kind of systems. And we just, let's build it from scratch and actually think like a long time. And Sidecore did that too. And Adobe did that too. But there's so much other stuff in that thinking gap.
Just trying, yeah. Change,
right?
yeah. Whereas versus these like from scratch, going headless.
Exactly, yeah.
I think we talked a little bit about this before. How you were talking about like 6 months for that huge project there, and like just how long.
No, that was only setting it up. We're now a year and something in, and we did 3 pages.
Wow. Okay, because that's a
in
big
20
thing that we
countries,
see.
Though.
In what?
In 20 countries, though. So that's a lot. It's a big release.
Because that's the biggest thing that we get from users here is like, how long is this going to take? If we decide to go with the solution of Prismic or Contentful or whatever, how long will this take? And how much will it cost? And I think we'll talk a little bit about that right after in the next slide, like where to begin, how do you do this progressively versus big bang, as you were talking about before. But I think let's put a caveat first on this, like how long does it switch take? What are we talking about? Like what's the scope of the project? How large it? How many services do you have?
Exactly. It's how big is that thing and how good is your team? And it doesn't always mean good, but do you have the right people with a different skill set that you might need? Do you have enough generalists and not just precise people to fix bugs in an old system, right? For this one project I just talked about, we had to hire almost a new team. And not that the other guys weren't good. They were fine, but we needed different types of people. And in the beginning, I told the client, they said, how fast can I have my homepage? And in that moment, I said 1 month. And that could have been done, but then we wouldn't have thought about all the other stuff. So we had the luxury to have this redesign going on, right? So they saw changes themselves as bosses, and we could spend 6 months on all of the basics. So we decided in the end to be safe enough, and we went with all of the basics. And then after that, it was component after component. Every week, stuff went live. So you might take a slow approach with the real architecture head on, and then run like the wind. You can also run like the wind and then over time try to make it better. Both are fine. And if you go from a project, it's almost impossible to tell you. It also depends on what kind of company you have. Like where I work, we are more doers than presenters. And there are other companies that are also, how do you say, like we are in the sphere of consultancy, right? There's a lot of bigger companies that do 4 months of thinking, PowerPoint presentation, business things, planning of teams, and you pay for all that. It makes a lot of sense. And then they go black box for half a year, and then they go another black box for QA, and then it's done. That's a way to go. We are much more of, so in the first 2 weeks, I can do that already for you. And all these brands are like, really? Why? Huh? And this happens. I've been in those meetings, and we tend to do that. And because we have so much experience now as a global company working with so many people from different teams and different offices on one project, that you kind of learn from each other. And it's not easy because we sometimes start way too fast, make fast decisions, and then it all goes to hell. I've been there. Right now, I'm in a project where that happened. Luckily, we turned it around. But yeah, that can happen, right? So I have no answer for you. I'm sorry.
By the way, guys, I know we're a little bit over time here, but feel free to stay with us. We're going to still be here for a couple of minutes here with Tim. So I guess that takes us to where to begin. And I think that's a great way of what we were just talking about there, of the incremental migration versus a big bang. And that's something that personally we see a lot of times with projects with our clients, and we recommend like do a POC, scope whatever like it is you do. Just try it out, like try the API out, see how easy it is, and kind of like do a little like MVP or whatever you want.
Prototypes is everything. You already said it, because a prototype first, or a proof of concept, and then an MVP. MVP is the word. And I have clients that thought it meant maximum viable product. Well, of course, it means minimum viable product. When we heard that, we were dying of laughter. But this is real life sometimes. But MVPs are super important. And so I think the combination of having someone who is kind of front-end focused but understands the cloud and architecture, someone a little bit in my position, can really help to have the experience of, if you connect those two things together, that's hard, but if you connect those two, it's easier. Like Vue Storefront and Storyblock is something that just goes like that, and you can do a really quick proof of concept. But doing something else might be harder, right? So you need to have experience. It's not so easy, because how do you get experience, right? By failing. I failed so often, man. You don't want to know. That's how it goes. But generally, the proof of concept should be small, just connecting things together to see how it feels. And then you present that. And then the only drawback of doing these kind of things is time and budget, right? Does a client want to spend, 100K on you doing something for 6 months that might not work? So yeah, again, it's pretty hard to convince people sometimes, but let's imagine you're in, right? You get to do it. Then I would say make sure that the data layer is steady, that you have thought about how the data is modeled, that you thought about how can I implement or import the old data, because migration is always a product on its own, and people always forget because you just start running and build this cool thing. But old data needs to be matched for SEO reasons, or for just I'm migrating a website. So make sure your data approach is on point. And after that is just make sure you build, but go slow. I would say really go component based. Don't think in pages, think in components. Because components you can design really well. Design wise, you can name them well. You can do UX on them. And then if you give people, let's say 20 components, you can actually just mix and match, and suddenly you have pages. Pages don't really mean much anymore. In my opinion, they shouldn't. Right. So what we tend to do with a client, if we have to do a project that's new, but they have something old, we literally print out all their pages, and we take scissors and we just do an exercise of what are your components? Do you know? Some clients is like, oh, here's our storybook. I'm like, okay, we're good. Let's run. Not every client has that. So we do the exercise with them. And basically, there's almost more homework for the product owner and the client than for the agency. So make sure that they know there's homework, make sure that they understand what they're doing, and go MVP, which means, let's say we have 4 sprints of 2 weeks. This is the amount of work we can do. The other stuff you'll get later. So beware that this product owner person tells their boss, these are the things we're going to put in. So business value calculations, right? Really know what is good for your user. So it's really client focused, actually. It's not that technical. Well, of course, there's details in tech. If you do an MVP, you're not going to do unit tests, maybe. Yep. You might. Not everybody does that, but that can come later.
No, but you're totally right. And I think that takes us to that second point, actually identifying the business models. Because especially now that like you've got so many headless CMSs on the market, like, which one do I begin with? Like which one should I go for? And I think that's where you really want to focus on what are your needs? Like am I an
Exactly.
editorial website? Do I need to be able to publish things and like be able to have it build like really, really quickly? Am I an e-commerce where I need to be able to like create sales or new launch products, things like that? And I think that's a
Yeah.
big part of it is like shortlisting which ones you want, in order, because as you say, you have a short time frame. You have maybe like a 2-week sprint. You only have 3 sprints, and then you got to determine which one you want to go for.
Yeah, so it's homework again, and you see people choosing the weirdest solutions, right? We've seen like an e-commerce where they didn't need that much content because most of it came from the e-commerce system, and they had like a headless CMS. I think it was Contentful, just for a dictionary and a dictionary is like key value pairs. That's a pretty expensive dictionary, right? So that's like running without thinking. Like it's really hard sometimes to think but also be fast and doing it. And so it's just experience also, and having the right people on your team that can make decisions fast, and then also have people in the team that can take some time to make decisions so they can explain why we made the decisions. This is the hardest thing. Like, I'm lucky enough to be on a relatively high level in my company where I have a lot of experience, and I also have access to others that are way better than me, have more experience. So we tend to just say, okay, this is the project, and people with a lot of experience, after half an hour, they tend to know it's just going to be this. But you cannot just go to your client, especially in France or in any Latin country, to say this is going to be it. No, they don't learn that way. They don't get convinced that way. So you also need people who are then going to spend 2 weeks of UX exercises, user testing, go to the cloud service and actually ask questions, and like, how do we scale this, and like all this architecture stuff, and then make a presentation and then do a 30-minute talk that basically comes to the same conclusion as that experienced person. But then you have a story, and then your client will say, okay, yes, let's run with it. So this is a crazy thing that you need for people that you have in your team that just already know it's likely it's going to be here. So I'm going to start doing some code. So next week you can see something. And then you have people who just go completely in parallel and then come back and show the client, and it comes together. So if you have a good project, that comes together. So my recent project that I'm working on right now, we're sprint 2 now of 3, which is really short. It's going to look really good. And we did it exactly that way. So it took a while to get it in, but once we got it, we had to start like right now, because otherwise it's not going to be done on time. But I'm still working with the creative people and with the process people to make it all approved. And then once we go live, that all comes together and it works.
A few moments later.
So thanks for those who stayed. We're still on. I think we're going to still be on for about a couple, like 15 minutes. And pretty soon we're going to open the floor also to questions. So feel free to post those on the chat. I guess let's just like finish up with this slide real quick and
Sure.
about which services do you decouple first? Like, which are the ones that you start with? You were talking recently about like the last part was like I think the e-commerce part. You're saying like that's probably the hardest part.
Yeah, exactly. For me, clearly, the easiest one by far is media as a delivery. It's by far the easiest because generally the companies that do media delivery or even DAM systems, or digital asset management, they are so flexible they can connect to something without really interfering too much. So we generally start with that one. After that, generally user accounts, GDPR stuff, because user accounts can also be a separate system that just hooks into the system that you have in the monolith, let's say. So basically, a system like Gdpr, for example, can really easily create a user account inside your Sitecore or your WordPress, or you can link together really well. And if you have a system like that, your terms and conditions, newsletter subscriptions, all of those stuff are taken away by them, and that works really well. What else? I just had one. I don't know anymore. But
I guess what we see from
honestly,
like
content is kind of last.
content.
Yeah, generally, well, e-commerce is last.
Yeah,
but because it's generally the heart of the system, right?
That's what we see here. When people ever start, it's usually going to be like, especially we're talking like maybe like a startup company that's like an e-commerce. They have a blog. That's like usually one of the easiest things to start with.
Exactly.
It's like pretty simple. Again, you wrap your head around the API, how to query that, and then you move on to more complex things like more like specific landing pages, marketing content, and then I think like the last is going to be like the e-commerce section. All of
You know
that.
what an easy one is? Actually ratings and reviews, these kind of things, because in e-commerce they're always half baked in, or not really working. So we have companies like Bazaar Voice that do that really well, and you just put it in and it works. Or things like social media feeds, right? I guess all developers hate them because they're hard to implement and the third parties are a bit shitty. But that's again something you don't want to be building yourself. So those kind of things work really well. And those are like all these things I mentioned are all SaaS systems, right? But they're just not as important as, let's say, a content management system. But yeah, it's relatively easy if you just look at it and see which things can I pry off, which are simple to use in SaaS systems.
And that also are not going to break your monolithic system, right? Like that's one of the big things.
Exactly. This is basically the thing. Do as much as you can without breaking the core. And then once it's all there, you just replace the core. And it's not always easy, right? Because for this big client we just had to build a layer in between so the core is kind of safe. When you plug it out, not everything dies. I've seen that too. And that's hard, right?
All right. So I guess the last part here is just how do you adapt your stack to microservices? You know, like which technology do I choose? You know, like if I got a traditional like PHP system, you know, what do I want to go for?
I would say if you want to serve content as a content website, generally, if you're just serving content like things, I would say a Node.js stack is by far the easiest to go for, right? Because everybody is learning JavaScript now. And a lot of people that are JavaScripters are starting to use the HTTP stack and understanding security and backend code. And there's a lot of really good systems out there that actually, like in Node.js, you have Express, which is like an HTTP server, like the Apache of Node, which is super stable and works really well. However, because I'm a front-end guy, I'm saying this, that doesn't always mean it's true. Actually, it comes down to your team again. What are their
strengths?
What are the skill sets? How can you deal with learning curves? If you're outsourcing, can you tell them to just do something new? They are smart enough, but do you have the time? And it's all kind of based on that process of what can these people do quickly. And then next to that, of course, you have best practices and you have best in breeds. Like a lot of people will just tell you right now, go React, right? Because React can do React Native, it can do server-side rendering, it can do really well with TypeScript. So there's all these buzzwords going for it. And plus, it's the biggest. They're not the biggest grower, which is Vue.js, but that doesn't matter. They are the biggest. The problem is, however, because there are so many people doing it, like with PHP, there's so many WordPress PHP developers. In a group of 100 people, there bounds to be one that's batshit crazy, right? If you have 100 React developers, of those 25 are not going to be giving you really good React code. And that's because it's not because of them. It's because React is so composable and so small in its components, and it's so free. And you have to be such a good developer to do really good React code. So if you are a really good developer, React is by far, it's awesome. Run with it, do it. But again, if you have near source outsourcing, or near shore, or you have a team of juniors and you have to teach them something, you might want to go with something that's closer to web technology rather than to application technology, right? If you want to go with Angular, if you're a C# or a Java developer, Angular is going to be pretty cool. You're going to run with it. But if you are just a front-end person and you suddenly have to use Angular, you're not going to understand how all those patterns work. Those design patterns, it's just not going to happen. So that's a pretty stupid choice for a small agency if you don't have people like that. If you have people who are awesome at CSS and HTML, just go with Vue.js because it's template focused. It's driven on having a sort of a DOM thing that you can attach stuff to. And then suddenly it's much easier to work with. And you can do something like Vue.js in a super simple way, stateless. I'm not going to go really deep now into front-end technologies. That's a whole other talk. But again, look at what is out there that is represented well, but not as much that you can get a lot of people that are not so good at it. It's a really tricky thing, right? And I have friends of mine who are really good React developers that are just going as freelancer to fix up old React projects. It's an awesome job, but that's crazy that this has to happen, right? Because it exploded on the scene. And it's hard, it's easy to find people, of course, but to find the right ones. And the same goes with cloud engineers, right? If there's something I have learned recently is that being a cloud engineer, you have to be some sort of genius. It's so hard to connect everything together to make it all work, especially when you come from my background. Like recently I went from front-end developer to web developer, right? I had to widen my horizon and try to use like the Azure cloud and how to connect stuff. And I didn't even know any basic terminology. And so, of course, you learn over time, you have some experience, you go for it. But if you have those people, a choice in stack is much easier. So having some history with it will help also.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that definitely speaks to like if people don't necessarily have those skills internally, that's when you definitely go for an agency. And we definitely do see that a lot. People that are just used to implementing that versus people that have been using that traditional monolithic approach and have to learn everything going there. And that's when you're going to have like a really, really long and arduous long time to switch.
Yeah, and you might actually do it the wrong way, because if you have this microservices thing, there's a lot of things, there's more service area to go wrong, right? Because they all have their own quirks. So if you go wrong in 2 out of 5, you're going to have a really bad time, right? Because how does that finger pointing then work? Again, how are you safe in your contract? So as you notice, like I'm a developer, I go so often to the business side of things because that's where the success is. It's kind of strange, but I guess it's true that way.
For sure. I think, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. So let's just take the floor to the questions.
Yeah, sure.
And see if we have anything. I'm going to check with Edward if he's communicated any questions there. I guess
I'm not seeing many.
Not seeing any. Nope. Guess we covered everything.
Well, we spoke a lot. And you know what's funny? Nothing is a straight answer. Nothing.
Caveats all over the place. And
yes, exactly.
Depends on your project.
Everything depends.
Well, I guess, Tim, again, thank you for your time. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to reach out to him. We'll share this presentation after the call.
Actually, Diego has a question.
Oh.
Sorry, Edward, I did your job. Thanks, Simon. Diego, what's your question? This is actually a really good question, and it's not that hard, because both Azure and Amazon, AWS, have free tiers, and you can spend a whole bunch of time in the things I discussed just now. Cloud providers get expensive when you start to use their CDNs or their search indexation tools, and some CDNs are a bit different than others, but generally. So not CDNs, but cloud services are generally that way. I always opt for, if I want to use some sort of SaaS service, in my opinion, they're generally startups, and they should give you some sort of free tier. Because
let me tell you, Prismic has a free tier that's pretty generous. You can try out the API. You can do a lot of things with it. Unlimited API calls. You can really, really play around with it and get a feel for the
I was
tool.
just going to push you. Yes, this is true. Because this is one thing I really get annoyed by, and this is just maybe me, but there's all these startups or more than startups or even bootstrapped companies that have this product and they want to sell it to you, right? And because of my title, they send me emails in Valtech and can we be partners? And my first question is, give me a free account. I'm now going to use it. If I like it, I will pitch it to that client tomorrow. And they're mostly like, yeah, but we don't have a free tier. It's like, okay, it's done. If people like me who are able to pitch to these kind of clients, and it's not just me, hey, I'm cool. There are many more people in my level in a company. If you let them play for free, figure shit out, see if it works, form an opinion, like I can pretty easily pitch Prismic now, and I have. because I like it. I figured out some stuff. I made a video about it, and now people in my company know about Prismic. And now we might create some sort of partnership at one point. If it didn't have a free tier, I would not have used it. So things like Storyblock, things like Algolia, things like, there's so many that have this free tier. I've learned so much recently just using those. So yeah, Diego just, and you know what I've learned? If you just tweet at them and say, hey, I'm in this position, I want to work in this, can you give me a 30-day trial? They'll say yes. Don't worry about it. They will. I just complain that I want a free trial forever, but that's just me. No, but like recently, for example, I worked with a company called Caliber, and they do really good performance tests over time for your web pages. So for a project, I spoke to their CEO, and I said, I want to do this for my project, make a video about it and write something. And he said, yeah, I'll just make you an account. So I literally just asked him, give me that. He said, sure. So Diego, in Dutch, we say you have the yes. Oh no, you have the no, but the yes you can get. So you just ask.
Just ask.
Yep.
I think we got another question.
Which are more friendly for microservice architecture, statically generated websites or server served? In my opinion, it depends on what your use case is, but I love the statically generated stuff, because in your base, you will use the statically generated things because it's cheaper, it's harder to hack, and you will use a lot less API calls to Prismic, for example, because you do it on build and then you run with it. And then after that, you can add other microservices that are runtime, shall we say. So for me, it's always the combination. And of course, not every website, like if you do an e-commerce, you might not want to go full static. But if you have Shopify and you want to use Gridsum or you want to use Gatsby, that works really well. Like the other day, I followed a tutorial, and in 10 minutes, I had a Shopify website statically generated. And when you click on checkout, you just go to the Shopify checkout. And suddenly I had a static website with a dynamic backend. It just worked. So for me, it's always static first, and then you add stuff to it. Because the hosting will cost you almost nothing. Go to Netlify, it's free. Go to Versal, it's free. On Amazon, it costs a bit, but not much. And oh no, it's actually free because I think Amazon just did static web apps. Their new product. It's really cool. It basically has everything of the cloud that they offer already in a very simple thing. Yeah, so Azure Static Web Apps, Debbie is pushing it. Yes, I love that one. Oh, and then you have Amazon Amplify. There you go. And Amplify is also a really cool tool for all of this. I have not jumped into that one a lot, but actually I have a video for my YouTube channel planned with the product owner of Amplify, and we together will go over it in a form like this, and he will just share his screen and show how it works. So I hope to learn a lot about that one too.
Cool. Are we seeing any more questions here? Let me see. I think
we're no.
Last chance, folks, for the questions. No.
Good.
All right. Well, again, Tim, thanks very much for your time. This was great. Thanks for sharing all your experience, folks. Thanks for attending. Again, we'll share the links here after the webinar, and see you all next time.
Thanks very much for having me. I had a really good time.